Welcome to the fourth book discussion session under our series Rendezvous with the Author. We have all realized how educative and illuminating it is to interact directly with accomplished authors who are senior practitioners in various fields, from policy to military, and etc. And today, to enlighten us further, we have with us a very senior practitioner of public policy, Mr. Shankkar Aiyar. Mr. Aiyar is a former journalist who writes regularly on political economy and on challenges in India, an author, an analyst, and one of the most erudite commentators on the policy landscape in India. His 1991 scoop on a bankrupt India pledging its gold reserves was what actually made the Indian public realize or aware of the deep economic crisis that India was in. He is also a visiting fellow at IDFC Institute. He recently wrote a book titled The Gated Republic, India's Public Policy Failures and Private Solutions, which is the topic of today's discussion. The book provides a disturbing account of various public policy failures in the country in areas from health to education to police reforms. It says, in the absence of public solutions, which actually the constitution mandates, that all governments provide, to us at all levels, citizens are increasingly turning towards private band-aid solutions. Example, prevalence of RO purifier or even underground boring well packaged drinking water systems. Such markets exist because the governance mechanism has failed to provide clean drinking water to the people of the country. No wonder there's a strong and thriving tanker mafia in various cities. Many more examples abound in other policy areas. On the whole, a book that must be read by all who are interested in understanding the vast challenges we face and those who are motivated to find solutions to them. I'd also say that every relevant government functionary should be reading this book in order to get a much needed reality check. In fact, not just this book by Mr. Aiyar, but even other books that now Mr. Aiyar will describe for us. Mr. Aiyar.
Thank you, Deepanshu. It's a pleasure to be speaking to book readers. I just wanted to place my own journey of writing. I've been a journalist for over 35 years, and much of the time I've been writing about the interface of politics and economics, essentially how politics affects the pockets and economics of people. My first book, Accidental India, the premise was that change comes to India only when there is a crisis. And then I took 7 transformative moments: software revolution, liberalization, milk revolution, bank nationalization, RTI, and I sort of proved, validated, chronicled the history of how that happened. So the first book says that change comes only when there is a crisis. My second book, Aadhaar, was triggered by the fact that there was no apparent crisis, and yet Aadhaar came to be in a landscape that is riveted in various inadequacies. I mean, you think about it, India created the world's largest biometric identity system. And today we are proudly, every government sort of proudly talks about the direct benefit transfer that we can do. And it's in billions of dollars that we are doing. And because of the Aadhaar enabled system, we have a high number of real-time transactions. So the first book said, change comes only when there is a crisis. The second book, I examined how change can come even when there is no crisis. That crisis is not necessarily a precondition for change and transformation. The book that we're discussing today, The Gated Republic, is sadly the third part of this series. Gated Republic proves that even when there is a crisis, sometimes change doesn't arrive. Otherwise, how do we explain that India spends just maybe less than 3% or 2.5% of its GDP on education, despite the fact that in the 60s we aimed at providing 6% of the GDP, or that we spend less than 1.5% on health, and the consequences we have observed in the pandemic? Or why merely 25% of the population has piped water. I mean, Bundelkhand, the area which is water scarce, has 20 packaged water plants. And that's the kind of riveting contrast that we see. And it's the same story. I mean, no builder worth his name in India can sell an apartment in India in any of the cities without providing for a backup power system. So an inverter is part of the conversation now, part of the vocabulary in India. And you can't enter any city, any bank, any society without seeing a gray pant shirt guy, which is the private security guy. We're the only country in the world where private security exceeds total constabulary across the states. And as we speak, I think people are sort of recognizing that this is happening. Practitioners are trying to find solutions for this. And it's a long way ahead, because this is what I called in the epilogue of my first book, I called the silent crises. Crises which are there for decades, and yet they have not been resolved. So India is a great contradiction. We have the largest number of billionaires and the largest number of poor people. We produce the largest number of graduates, roughly 27 to 30 million graduates. And we also have the largest number of people who can't read or write. We can send a Mars orbit mission for the cost of less than what it cost Hollywood to produce Gravity, the movie. But we can't deliver water to people. And so we struggle with issues. So we have episodic success. We conduct elections. I mean, it's a mind-boggling exercise. 900 million voters. And yet, when it comes to delivering on the most basic of public services, India's governments really falter. It's a combination of issues, but I'll sort of, we can discuss this. I would love to hear what your thoughts are, what your audience and the other readers have questions. I'm happy to take as many questions as you want.
No, actually, Mr. Aiyar, it's a very interesting thing that you mentioned, that India is a land of contrasts, in the sense that, and you write it in the book, that everything that we say about India, its opposite is also true. On one hand, we have great tech success, economic success happening in certain areas, but on the other hand, we have failed to provide certain basic fundamental services that, we ought to provide as a welfare state, or, a state that's trying to become a welfare state. So, the thing that you mentioned about the number of private security guards across colonies in the country, exceeding the number of government constabulary, I'll start off with a question on law and order. We all sort of have a brief understanding of, what kind of police reforms we need. Every crime that takes place in the country, which gets the media attention that it deserves, it gets the media attention it deserves. So the debate automatically moves to, we need reforms in these areas, we need reforms in that areas, but that's been one area that's hardly seen any action. How do we as citizens of the country ensure that we create an urgent constituency for police reforms, so that some progress takes place in that particular area? Because we see that in general the police system in union territories, it's slightly or relatively better compared to what exists in the states, but even that is below par, when we compare to international standards, or when we compare to even not great international standards but other not so developed countries. We are actually doing very bad when it comes to policing and law and order. So how do we create an urgent constituency so that the system is actually able to bring out the necessary police reforms?
I think this part of it is legacy. Part of it is because we had tall leaders when we attained independence. And so the system, even though the constitution is written in a quasi-federal federal system, the mindset is centralized. So you have in a general election, the prime ministerial candidate or the people who are contesting for parliament, the party that wants to come to power, speaks about delivering services which are really the responsibility of the third tier of government, center, states, and in a similar way, the flip side of it, the voter interest, the citizenry doesn't question the state government. For instance, just now, as we speak, roughly 600,000 posts of police personnel are vacant across the states. Now, some questions appear in parliament about this, and the standard answer is law and order is a state subject. And then they say we have provided so many funds, we are doing this, we are modernizing. There are police stations without vehicles, police stations which don't have power, police stations which don't have toilets. There's the other aspect of it. So what will make the change happen? So one has to understand that in the political arena, in the electoral politics, there is a strong consensus. There's a strong consensus for weak reforms. So it is up to the people to raise the questions, ask their representatives as to why we don't have a police station here. Why is the police station poorly equipped? Now, it's also an issue on which you should ideally vote. It's a life and death situation on which you vote. But as we know, India votes on emotions, on passions. The classic cliche is that we cast our vote on caste. Underlying all this, and I'll expand on this later, is that there is no pontoon bridge between the electors and the elected, between the principal and the agent. And so what happens is that the people tend to become subjects. In some ways, India's democracy functions once in 5 years. That's the only time we vote, because there is no real engagement happening unless it's a protest or a dharna, or people writing letters to newspapers or going on air in media and the media reportage. Why is it this vacancy is not being filled? You ask the state governments, it's a mixture of finding people. I mean, can you imagine a police constable's job is not exactly what you need a Stanford or a Harvard graduate degree for. It will help, but that's not. And we have millions of people who are unemployed. And yet those vacancies are not filled. So it's an issue of budgeting, allocation of funds. Now, between them, all the states put together last year spent 39 lakh crores. The center spent something roughly 30 lakh crores. So that's 69 lakh crores. Now divided by 365, and you know what kind of money is being spent, taxpayer money, that money belonging to you, me, and all the readers and people who are concerned. What is this money going for? It's going to run the government. So it's a very classic perversion. The government of the people doesn't quite function for the people. And so this is an ongoing issue, and this is the underlying construct of all the failures that we have. A, the disincentive process in the electoral system. B, funding. C, accountability. Most important is the architecture that we have of governance. So the center decides policy, the implementation is left to the states. The states have very little say in policy, and the center has very little say in the implementation. If some states, for instance, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, all these states in have issues of law and order. And these are the states where the vacancies are the highest. And it's amazing. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, it's the most apparent thing. Why wouldn't you appoint constables? Why wouldn't you make the police? So it's a very incremental process because it's easier to win elections with loan waivers, with packages, with freebies, free laptops, and stuff like that. That's what gets the media attention. There's also a fault in the way we cover our political economy, particularly in the media, is that the union budget is covered as if it is Christmas, Easter, Diwali, everything put together. There's so much attention. 30 states spend more money than the center, and yet there is hardly any coverage of state budgets. So the engagement process that you require for policy to change, for change to happen, that isn't there. It's very fragile. It functions only in a crisis. It functions only in exception. I mean, the Gated Republic has been perhaps the most depressing book that I've written. I mean, it was depressing on every segment, whether it's education, health, water. There's no dearth of literature on what needs to be done. They can't find people to get things done. And finally, politics functions on an incentive process. The incentive to do is not there. Worse, what is worse is there is no disincentive for those who don't do it. And that's the sad part for us. And there have been moments. I mean, rural electrification, for instance, when the Prime Minister took it up, Prime Minister Modi sort of ramped up, he put a special team on it, and it got done. Now they're trying to do that with water. Now, water is a far more complex subject than getting a wire and transmission into a village. And, it requires out-of-the-box thinking. Every city in India, for instance, gets its water from between 20 to 50 kilometers away, largely from a dam that is being built for irrigation. And every city starts talking about water cuts around December, January, just before the summer approaches. And there is going to be pressure across cities. Bangalore, you would know that a couple of years back, they said it's approaching zero water. The Niti Aayog has put out a large report on the complete disaster that the specter that we are facing. But is that enough conversation around it? Is there enough? And so if you look at health, for instance, we've had so many elections after the pandemic. Health was mentioned by the way. It didn't figure as a central issue. I mean, Bihar has the least number of doctors in any state. It has roughly about 45,000 doctors for a population of over 12 crore. I think about 120 million people. But what's happening to the health system there is not a subject of debate. And I dare say, when we have the UP elections next year, it still won't be the debate there. And so it's a hard task for a policy writer, policy author of policies to sort of push an agenda. But here's what I think literate, cognitive people can sort of contribute is to push the envelope continuously, talk about these issues, raise these issues. When we sort of come to the end of all your questions, I have a thought on that, but I'll just park it for now.
Well, very important point, sir. I think one of the most important in that sense is that not just police reforms, but even other reforms are not being given the urgency that they deserve, because general interconnecting bridge between the voters and those who are elected, or the electors or the elected, that simply does not exist. And therefore, what decides whether a matter is urgent or not is something which is totally different from what it ought to be, due to the media glare that focuses on some issues that are probably convenient, or it offers an incentive, or the issues that actually need to be covered in order to create an urban constituency amongst the people. That's not happening. And you make another interesting point that the government is actually spending a huge amount, of course the amount that comes from taxpayers money, on various schemes and services, etc., but is it really creating the impact that we wanted to? The answer to that question remains no. And hence my next question would be about another point that you make in the book. You mentioned statistics, comparing government expenditure on delivery of social services, in the preface of the book, expenditure across different years. With it, you mentioned the inefficiency in that expenditure. So my question is, over and above the JAM Trinity, which is the Jan Dhan account opening, Aadhaar card, and the mobile connections, over and above that JAM Trinity, which has led to some relative efficiency in that targeting of expenditure, what else can be done to make this expenditure more targeted and more effective?
So there's a concept of flow chart that corporates follow, that how many touch points does a policy move through. So it begins at the planning of that, how many people are sort of, and when something, we have more people auditing payments and less people auditing implementation. We have more people in the ministries overseeing the documentation, and fewer people actually in the field. If you see very curiously, and this is something that I've written about consistently, is the government of India's ministries at the center. The largest ministries and the maximum budgetary allocations are subjects which actually are state subjects. And in the state government, the most prized portfolios are not public delivery systems. The prized portfolios are those which politicians sort of quote unquote, and people have come to sort of associate with future prospects, ambition, and stuff like that. So as a result, the political system doesn't produce the kind of champions who can get in and do that. We always have an exception to the rule. For instance, we've had Nitin Gadkari in the roads and highways project. And he has done a lot in Maharashtra when he was the Public Works Department Minister. He dismantled a whole number of gazettes which had strange requirements on how flyovers are to be made or how roads are to be made. He has done the same at the center. But it's an issue of too much government in the process of a project and not enough government in the oversight, in the implementation. We are probably, for instance, the only country in the world which provides budgetary allocation for potholes, filling potholes in city corporations, in state governments and stuff. And we have so many institutes. How can we not fix this issue? How can it not be? So for highways, we have a running contract of maintenance and it gets done. But for other roads, we don't have. Similarly, if you look at water, cities brazenly are dependent on water tankers, whereas groundwater management is I mean, is anybody's domain. I mean, so every city you will see these tankers moving around. It's a mafia. I think the efficiency of the rupee that is spent on any policy or project lacks oversight. There is the CAG, there are the parliamentary standing committees, but there's not enough public pressure also. There's not enough discussion around. So over the last few years, for instance, there is a lot of lather, I mean, about how we do on ease of doing business, how we're doing on human development indicators. But it's there for a day, for 2 days, and then it's back to the political process. I think the efficiency of outcomes can only happen if the way government is now is redesigned. I think we need a serious rethink on how we design our systems. It starts at the IAS level. My friends in the IAS get most upset when I say that you guys are an expert on vaccination for 2 years and passive euthanasia for the next 2 years. I mean, you are an expert on road building and suddenly you are shifted to WTO commerce. There has to be some value for domain expertise and how that is to be done. Do the ministries have that kind of domain expertise to shrink the process? For instance, if you want to put up a power project in India, you require something like 90 clearances. And government after government, they know this, that this delays things, that it costs the project, this is public money that is stuck. Yet the number of clearances, it doesn't get shrunk. So, I mean, I asked, why should every project that is in the state have to come to Delhi for clearance? You have a policy in Delhi, the states must follow it. That's it. But that isn't the case in practice.
Very important point, sir, because no matter what policy we follow in terms of making the expenditure efficient, as long as the very system within which that expenditure is routing or flowing, it's only so much more impact that it can do, but it will be less than ideal. You rightly say that the book is disturbing because it really alarms us that these are the kind of stories that exist in almost every district in the country, wherein the basic services are not, people are not getting those basic services. And within that disturbing account, I think I found the story of Cherrapunji and Mausamran to be relatively more disturbing. Why? Because they are two places with the highest rainfall receipt in the world, and yet their residents are provided rationed water supply, for only 1 hour per day. Wettest place geographically, but a dry place, practically. So my question is our bureaucracy or society or even political leadership, because these three things work together, right, to bring out any change. So are these three wings or stakeholders, bureaucracy, society, or political leadership, are they that unconcerned or ineffective or unimaginative that we don't have a minimal rainwater harvesting mechanism set up in the highest rainfall receiving places?
So if you look at India's rainfall precipitation data, and I've mentioned this in the book, you realize that quite a bit of water we have letting it flow into the ocean because we have struggled to manage the storage. So in a place like Cherrapunji and other places where it's dry, the issue is storage, the issue is piping, the issue is also how you manage the groundwater. So a far more important issue than rainwater, I mean, rainwater harvesting is very useful, very critical. But say in an urban place like Pune or Mumbai or Delhi, there's hardly any unpaved space. So rainwater has to be channelized. So there is also the concept of recycling of water, which we simply don't want to sort of get into it. I mean, Singapore has a project called Zero Water, which they recycle almost everything. Israel, it's in a desert area, it exports water to Jordan. And those are examples where the administration came up with a plan, the political system backed it, and then implemented it. So, what does it come back to? I mean, the question is, what's the kind of national purpose that politicians have? Political parties, we've written, we've argued, must have a consensus on a basic few minimum things. We'll get education here, we'll get water here, this is, and all these issues, there is going to be a consensus on how it's to be done. But that doesn't happen. And there is great schadenfreude in the system that one state is done worse than the other state. Look at health and education. Himachal Pradesh, a hilly state, has done much better than states in piped water. Himachal Pradesh does very well. What's the difference? The community engagement, the quality of, I mean, the commitment of the bureaucracy and the political backing that comes together. Tamil Nadu does well in education. Kerala is way ahead of India and many developed states in terms of its health and education. Look at other northeastern states on malnutrition, on education, they do far better than the states in the plains. So there is a need for a common minimum program across parties. There is a need for domain expertise on all this. So not only do we have a temporary political regime, you see, we say that there is a permanent government and a temporary government. Temporary government being every government gets elected 5 years if they last that long and the administration changes. But the bureaucracy is permanent. But the bureaucracy is not really permanent because the officers are getting shifted from one post. I mean, one day you're managing you're managing health. The other day, next year, 2 years later, you're managing state finances or investment. So there is a logical argument for bringing in laterally domain experts. So assuming we stay on with the all India cadre, the next level in every department has to be a domain expert. And that domain expert maybe should be able to draw expert advice. I mean, there has been some work, I mean, think tanks, NGOs have contributed to policy change domain. But nothing works like public pressure to put the feet of those in power to the heat, nothing. So if you look at, I always tell people, GST, they said it was very fine, nothing's wrong with it. And as we headed towards the election in Gujarat and other states, all the policies got changed, the tweaks happened, they came, because there's public pressure. Look at vaccination process now, the oxygen supply issues. Now there is a lot more discussion, debate on it. So there's nothing like public pressure to bring attention and focus to this. Now, there's also a need for a platform where this attention can be brought to. So just now, what we have is a kind of hybrid system. People go on social media and that creates its own pressure points and write about it and post about it. But there's also the traditional media. But the engagement that is required has to be at the ground level. Say you're in Noida, you have an issue. There must be a mechanism for people in Noida to be able to engage with the elected folks in Noida. And then take it up to the next level, which would be, say, the member of parliament. Take it up to the next level, which would be the state cabinet, the next level. So this process works very well in some countries. But at the base level, we don't plan well enough. Once we plan, we don't execute well enough. When we execute, there is lack of oversight. When we find mistakes, there's lack of accountability. So there's a 4-tier, 5-tier systemic problem. And all of it emanates from the way the governance structure is, which is the bipolar bipolar disorder between the center and the states. The divorce of accountability, authority. Those are issues that are visiting us in everyday life. They visit public policy. I think the more India sort of urbanizes, I think the more awareness is there, the more people travel and see that things can be better, that the more there is recognition that India can do better, Indians have done better, that there are. So, one of the principles that I advocate is on every issue, there are some states which have done well, and the best practices must be brought out and shared. There is a strange reluctance to share best practices.
Definitely, so the level of engagement has to be much more intense, which leads to proper concerns being highlighted, and that starts a discussion on all the challenges that we face. My next question is that you lament somewhere in the book over resource-starved independent India's spending focusing on mega projects, in areas from health to education, institutes of higher learning, dams, grand hospitals. But somewhere or the other, we focused more on institutes of higher purpose compared to something more fundamental that was more needed in independent India. So do you find that to be a primary cause behind India's health and educational problems at the fundamental level? Of course, there is government apathy, there is lack of accountability. But in addition to all those factors, do you feel that, or do you think that India's focusing more on mega projects right after independence and not focusing that much on fundamental institutions, has that led to the has that contributed partly to the problems that we face today? Whether it is great higher education institutions on one hand, but none when it comes to entry level requirements. So we have failed to ensure entry level institutes for the people of the country.
So I think these are contextual calls. I cite the issue of mega projects as an example of that. We had grand ideas, but when it comes to the basic, we had poor implementation. So the thinking at that time was that we require to do both. We need to have institutes of excellence, and those were created by the leadership at that time. But the leadership in the state governments, in public institutions, in the tier 3, in municipal corporations and so on, didn't focus enough on the very basic primary education. So we have created willy-nilly, by design or default, an education landscape where we have classes of people who have so if you, and this happens in many democracies, but the scale, the magnitude of our failure in primary education is astounding. So we provided funds, we created, if you look at the Right to Education Bill of 2009-10, it's pretty much what the Sargent report said in 1950. If you look at the new education policy now, it speaks the same language what Kothari Commission said in the 60s. Now, there has to be evolution and innovation, innovative thinking in how we address. The private sector has come up with some solutions. For years, India's governments were refusing to plan and implement telemedicine, plan and implement basic preventive healthcare. So you don't need too many hospitals. What you need is, health is not about doctors, nurses. It is about that, but it's also about what kind of public policy you have on water, on cleanliness, on hygiene. So it's very important to have the Swachh Bharat kind of program, but it's also important to have a a policy to curtail pollution. India continues to have a large part of its economy fueled by energy that is fossil driven. And so you have pollution, so you have 600,000 people dying of pollution related deaths. And for 20 years, governments have denied that pollution has anything to do with those deaths. I mean, how can you say that Indians are immune to pollution? So there is the context for the larger institutions, for the IIMs and IITs was relevant. The context for primary education was just as relevant. My trouble is that while we have what I call episodic success. We have great success, great institutions like IITs world over. Big tech corporations are run by people who came out of IIT in our engineering colleges. And yet we didn't invest enough manpower. So, as we speak, roughly 400,000 jobs in government schools are vacant, teacher posts. So you have high absenteeism, 25%, and 25% of the posts are vacant. What does that do to the students? I mean, let's look at it this way. In the last 15 months, students have struggled through the pandemic. There have been no schools. There are whole swath of the country which has no access to online education. Has there been a debate about that? So we debate about the urban. So the silent crisis doesn't get debated, doesn't get addressed. And there are countries which have done that. There are states which have done what is necessary to be done. So why is Mizoram or Manipur's education track record better? Why is Himachal's track record better? Why is Tamil Nadu done better? And why can't Bihar or Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh do better? So it comes to that. It's an issue. I said that we have great ideas, grand challenges. We are very good at. To have built Bhakra Nangal at that time in that era, it's an amazing accomplishment. But why were we not able to do the next things? Why were we not able to build the canals? Why were we not able to do the pipe water to cities? So in India, cities grow like amoeba. First, the private entrepreneurs go and build. Then the government follows with infrastructure. Then they search for where water will be found from. And people have gone to courts in the city, in this country, more for water and for air pollution than probably any other country. So the basics have to be got right. I mean, and there is an element of willful neglect in public policy about issues that affect the bottom of the pyramid. I say it with great humility that this is my understanding from looking at the research, the public policy journey that we've seen. And I say it with great responsibility that the voting class is not represented. I mean, we have the poorest people most excited about exercising their franchise. They think that change will come. They vote. But are they getting represented? Are their issues getting represented? The other aspect, I mean, the data point that I would present to you as to why things don't get done is you look at the number of days assemblies are in session across the year. There are states where the assembly meets maybe for 3 days in a month. I mean, in a whole year, the constitution says that every 6 months, 180 days, you have to meet. So they meet in the morning and shut down in the evening. So why are we electing people? I mean, so that they go to the assembly, so there's a lot of attention at the top, at the big tent, which is the parliament. There's some attention at the issues in parliament, but not enough attention in assemblies, not enough attention, discussion in assemblies. I'm surely the MLA from, say, Cherrapunji has an idea. He wants to debate why his people are not getting water. But if the assembly doesn't meet, how is he going to raise the issue? So again, it comes back. I'm sorry. I mean, this is the running theme of the book, that there is the, the political incentive process is failing the people.
Thank you so much, sir, for the detailed answers, because I think public policy debates really are endless in that sense, because there are multiple issues that need to be discussed, and multiple angles that need to be brought in. And I'm sure the detailed answers by you have actually cut down on the doubts and questions that strike our mind when we think about the fundamental challenges that India faces. Let's now move over to the questions from the audience. We can have a show of hands and then invite them to ask their questions. Also, we have only 10 minutes left because this is a 60-minute session. So first we'll go to Swati ji, because she had filled out the form and asked a specific question over there. Swati ji, if you can hear us, kindly
Yes, yes.
ask the question that you have filled up in the form. Go ahead.
Sir, it is wonderful to hear you talk, like what all aspects you have touched. In your the conversation, you just touched upon one thing, that it is because of the legacy we inherited that all our problems emanate from, right? So what I understand is that what problems we are confronting today, they have got something to do with our mindset that has been bequeathed to us. Like Ramayana mein Tulsidas bol gaye, kaun ripoy hame kahani. Like we as a people, we don't demand, which you also said. So don't you think like we need to sensitize our people, maybe during the primary education or at the family level, to demand it from the people who are basically our, whatever you may call them, whatever they are. Right now we have started treating them as my bab, but they're basically our servants, Indian administrative service, but they hardly behave like that. So is it not incumbent upon us to demand what we need, what we deserve?
Absolutely, you're right about that. Is that the citizenry has not been demanding enough. When they push the envelope, when the pressure comes, governments do respond. Politicians are smart people. They know where their vote comes from, and they will address those issues. What I also wanted to make a point is that when I say legacy, so every decade has its own context.
Yes.
So we had a decade where politics was a national mission. Thereafter, it became a profession. Thereafter, it became a business. Now I say half in jest that for a lot of political parties and political leaders, politics is the CSR arm of their business. I mean, so the missions, the spirit that we need, and there are people who have solutions. We have to find the champions. Indians have solved India's problems, whether it is milk, whether it's food grains, whether it is creating a sort of understanding of the need for enrollment in schools. The ideas have been there, but every decade you'll find that it takes a champion to build an institution, and then many champions to sort of sustain that process. And so again, why people are not demanding is people are also in their own circumstance. I mean, they're trying to just live, survive in many of the places. I mean, in the bottom two tiers of our income pyramid, they're just managing to survive, and there is an intimidation of authority, there is an intimidation of structure that exists, and these are can be overcome only when we have a more cogent system of engagement with communities. Individuals may not be able to raise an issue, but communities can, which is how, I mean, whatever success you see in Himachal or in Kerala, it's community engagement that has brought about the change in those states.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
There's another question, sir, that's been asked by Pranay. He's not here, so let me ask the question for him. He says that we all know how unhelpful our education system is. It churns out students who, not due to but despite the education system, make themselves skillful enough to be relevant in the work market. One gets a sense that the students and teachers, realizing this challenge, would jump at the opportunity of reforms and that reduce the component of rote learning and enable a holistic development. But in reality, what one gets is pure apathy towards such reforms, such as the CCE brought in by the UPA government. In that context, wherein probably the students and the teachers are not jumping at those reforms in as energetic a way as we imagine. In fact, they find a way around it by navigating and circumventing the requirements for projects and certain other non-rote learning related things. In this context, how do you place the problem of education, especially when another reform in the form of national education policy is around the corner?
So I think some of the issues are about where we are at a different level of, so the design of the curriculum is a function of what is needed for the students to equip themselves with and succeed. Now, there are very good models. I studied in Kendriya Vidyalaya Central School, and I'm proud of it because that curriculum equipped me, even if I had left school after 10, to find some occupation. Because for 5-6 years, we were taught vocation. We were taught gardening, filmmaking, carpentry, plumbing, electrician, everything we were taught, and in a proper way. And so we have the rudimentary knowledge of that. You were also taught, encouraged to participate in extracurricular stuff, elocution, all that. Now, these should form part of the curriculum and should be built around it. At a very macro level, and what I said was the specifics of how one school system, say Central School, Kendriya Vidyalaya Sangathan does it, or I'm sure other schools also do it. But at a macro level, rote learning may be an issue, but even that learning is not adequately imparted. The students required to be confident that when they come out of school, out of college, that what they have learned is going to be useful. So I think there isn't enough input from the economy, the political economy, say from employers, companies, institutes. Only in the last 10 years, for instance, or maybe 5 years, that actually we have institutes which teach public policy. We have institutes for languages, which so students go on. So not everything needs to be taught in a school, but you can have a coupon system where a student who is interested in a particular stream, say he wants to learn bonsai plants, or he wants to learn clock making, or whatever, he can take he could be funded to learn that. There's also the idea that in the 8th, 9th, 10th standard, people could sort of learn a particular vocation, be certified, they go out, do an apprenticeship of 3 months, and get a job. I mean, that apprenticeship should be there. There are people who have dropped out of school who are very good plumbers, who are very good tile makers, who are very good at their job. Now, those builders or organizations or institutes, for instance, can issue certificates which gives them a standing in the job market. So rote learning is a long-term issue. There are many debates around whether rote learning should be there, whether this is, what is an education? It's an education is basically equipping the person to inquire and know, which is learning to learn. Now you can build it around many different Lego models, many different aspects, and it's a very complex domain. The practical aspects have to be fixed first, and then you move into the core problem. So I think every education policy that has come out, including the one that has come out now, there's a lot of pious statements in there. What is missing is the implementation. How do you make that happen? I mean, if you read the 66 Kothari Commission reports and you read the latest education policy or the debates in Parliament, they all seem to be in consensus of what needs to be done. So again, it's a question of finding a champion who will create that curriculum and implement it.
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer, because education remains one of the most important areas, yet one area that we don't find focus being given upon. It's not just about the current government, it's about the governance mindset and the mindset in general towards public policy, that probably health and education do not receive the funds or the attention that they deserve, while of course they remain two very challenging areas for the country's governance ecosystem. Thank you so much, Mr. Aiyar, for taking out the time to talk to us. We wish you the best of health, and we look forward to reading more books by you and engaging in discussions on them. Today's session has been extremely educative, a very deep one, and the session has been organized with the collaboration of Rath Foundation, a leading NGO from Haryana. And we really look forward to organizing more book discussions with you, sir. And we wish you all the best in the journey ahead. Thank you, everyone.
Namaste. Thank you, Deepanshu. Thank you very much for this engaging conversation. And I wish everybody good health, stay safe, be mindful. That's my, and best wishes for the future.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
Thank you, sir.